Today we're going to be discussing the beginning of chapter 3, which is a discussion of the first Constitution of America, which is entitled what? The Articles of Confederation. One of the big discussions at this time, after you declare your independence, which they did on July the 4th, 1776, they have to set up a new government. But what kind of a government shall they set up? Is it going to be strong? Is it going to be weak? Do we know what strong is? Do we know what weak is? What kind of a government are we going to set up? That was the big discussion. And there was one personality among them whose picture you see on the top of page 66 that we're going to talk about. His name was John Dickinson. John Dickinson was initially opposed to independence. Do you remember our discussion about what question they were discussing before the Declaration? Are we good enough? Are we ready for this? And John Dickinson would always reply, no, I don't think we're quite ready enough. We're not ready to break from England yet. And so he proposed to write a letter to the king. He says, let me just write a letter to the king. I think I can convince him to be nicer to us. And this letter became known as the Olive Branch Petition to King George III. The Olive Branch Petition. Can you imagine what the king did when he got it? Didn't even read it. He just tore it to shreds, and he said basically, I'm not going to read anything from a bunch of traitors and rebels. And so he refused to read the letter. What do you think John Dickinson decided a few weeks later when he heard what the king did to his letter?
We're good enough.
I think it's time to go for independence. Maybe it's worse than I thought over there, and maybe we are more ready than I thought. So he was assigned to play a big part in the writing of the first Constitution for America. He decided to support independence and wound up writing the first draft of the Declaration of the Articles of Confederation. He writes the draft, he turns it over to Congress, and Congress is aghast because the first draft of the Articles is what?
Too powerful.
It's almost like turning us back to a dictatorship. In other words, the head of government is so strong, and it really surprises the rest of the Congress, and they said, we're not going to do this. And so they spent a number of months actually taking apart the draft, watering it down until it became extremely weak, which we will discuss.
Did he write it?
The question is, did he write it knowing that the country will be in war? Probably, because they were at war at that time. I mean, they knew that it was coming. But still in all, it was so different from what everybody wanted. They did not want a king. They didn't even want a head of their government, as you'll see when we study the Articles. So the draft was adopted November the 15th, 1777. How long is this after the Declaration of Independence?
About a year. Yeah, a year and a half.
Yeah, almost a year and a half before they finally decided on what form of government they wanted to have initially. But this was only the adopted date by Congress. It wasn't approved or ratified until nearly the end of the war. So, meanwhile, who was out fighting the battles?
Washington.
General Washington, trying to stave off the British as their soldiers were well into our country. And we'll describe some battles that he had in a little bit. But what we're saying here is the Revolutionary War was fought under the Articles of Confederation. And as I said before, the Articles of Confederation themselves were not really even ratified by all the states until the war was almost ended. So it was a very loose situation, very loose government under which we fought the war. Was that good or bad for Washington?
Bad.
we're going to see where the Articles of Confederation almost made us lose the war. It was such a tough, such a weak situation for Washington, but that's the situation he was cast in.
Washington was a good person.
So let's discuss, as you see on page 67 and 68, Dr. Skousen has given us a brief outline of the Articles so that you know what the first Constitution of America contained. Let me ask this question. Where do we get the name United States of America? You would think that that would be in our what? Constitution. Guess what?
It's not.
It isn't. It was already adopted in the Articles of Confederation. Our name, Article 1, establishes the name of our country, the United States of America. Founders who wrote this wanted to make sure that it was clearly understood that the several states, the 13 colonies that are now known as states, were sovereign. What does that mean, sovereign?
Meant they were supreme.
Yeah, they were. Nobody could tell them what to do without their consent. They were sovereign. They were separate. They were, yes, they were equal to a certain extent, but they were sovereign. And by establishing this union, we are not giving up any of our sovereignty. Do you see this? Could that lead to some problems?
Yeah.
We'll see that here in a few minutes. But that was Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation. What are we establishing here? If nobody's giving up any sovereignty, what are we establishing here? Well, we want to make the point that we're establishing just a nice friendship. What's actually called in Article 3 a league of friendship. Well, how far will that go when times are really tough? When you need to raise money, when you need to have taxes, when a little force is going to have to happen from time to time. What happens to a league of friendship? See, it's too loose. We'll see that. Okay? Article 4 of the Articles deals with the interstate relations. Do you need those kinds of things? Let's say, for example, you're married in one state and you go to another state. What would you expect that state to recognize? The marriage. In other words, the official acts of one state in a friendship, in a friendly nation, should be recognized in all other states. Do you see that? And so Article 4 of the Articles provided that there was some relationships between states, that all privileges of one citizen in one state would be recognized by all the other states. That's kind of nice, especially when you're traveling, right? You can feel sure that you have the same protection throughout the whole Union. And as we'll see, many of these items in the Articles were picked up in the Constitutional Convention and put right back into our Constitution that we have today. Okay, number 5, Article number 5 in the Articles, provided for the structure of Congress. You had this in your homework. What was the representation like in Congress under the Articles of Confederation? Who knows this? Each state could send how many delegates? No less than 2 and no more than 7. How do you like that? You can send as many as you want as long as it's not over 7, but you have to have 2. Well, how would you solve a problem if different states had different numbers? Little tiny Rhode Island may have 7 and big huge Virginia may have 2. How would you solve that inequity of representation in Congress? When it came time to a vote, what would you have to say?
Each state has a vote.
Each state gets 1 vote, which is what they did. Each state was to get 1 vote. Would that solve the problem? Well, at least that problem it would solve. So that was Article 5 in the structure of Congress. Some of the states agreed that they would take on certain limitations. For example, and this is Article 6, For example, no other state or no state could make a treaty. I mean, how would you like Virginia making a treaty with France, or making a treaty with Spain or another country? What would that do to the other states? See, it may even be to their detriment. So all the states agreed, we will not individually go making treaties. Is that reasonable? Yeah. Mike? To a certain extent, but not near as much as was done in the Constitutional Convention. Okay? They also agreed that they would have that they could not make war. They would not declare war on any other nation. In other words, some kind of a declaration of war would have to be made by Congress. Is that reasonable? Okay. In other words, a particular state would not go to war unless all 13 agreed. They also agreed that they would not have standing armies in their different states. What would that preclude? Why would you think that would be wise? Michael? Yeah. We don't want each state competing for the largest army. But they did allow and actually require that each state have a what? A militia. And as we've defined a militia, what's a militia? Made up of all the, do you know this? All the men, usually over age 17 in the state, and many states required that all of these men be armed and know how to use weapons. See, there's a tremendous military potential there. And so those are some of the things that, some of the limitations that were placed on them. Okay? Here's another one. Article 7 required that the states pay their fair share of the war. Article 8, yes. Article 8. Well, how would that be done? Congress would have to say, all right, we need certain amounts of provisions, and it's going to cost so much, and so they would basically divide up the money to the states, probably based on population. How do you think that would work? Then they would say, Connecticut, your assessment for the war is so many millions of dollars, and New York, yours is so many, and so forth. Do you see a weakness here, folks? What's the weakness in just making a suggestion, just making an assignment? Exactly what happened during the Revolutionary War. Washington's out there starving to death with his men, freezing to death, and Connecticut says, well, we won't send our assessment until New York sends hers. And the big problem is, under the Articles, as we will see, there is no power to what? To enforce this thing. Is that going to be a problem? Roman numeral 9, Article number 9, listed the powers of Congress. You see there on the first column of page 68. And as you read through here, which we won't do, as you read through here, you see some interesting things. For example, the power to determine if we're going to go to war, the power to receive ambassadors, to negotiate treaties, settle disputes, power to a certain extent over the money system. Do you recognize those powers? Many of those powers were picked up later in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which we will study. I want you to point out, however, or I want to point out to you in that Article 9, down near about the middle of the page. You see where it says the Congress shall have authority to appoint a committee of the states? Do you see that where I am? To manage the affairs of the United States while Congress is recessed. What does that provide for? When Congress is not in session, which they hopefully wouldn't be most of the time, who's running the country? A committee of states. A committee of states. In other words, the Articles of Confederation provides for no what?
President.
No president, no executive. Is that a weakness?
Yep.
They'll soon find out that that is. Okay? Article 11 is an interesting provision. It's an invitation to Canada to do what?
Join.
To join the Confederation, to join the Union.
Become the 14th state.
Right. If any other states wanted to join, what do they have to do?
Have so many people.
Have to be approved by Congress. But Canada, anytime Canada wants to join, it can be the 14th state and no further approval is necessary. It's kind of an interesting. That's why when they lost Canada, as we'll see in a minute, it was devastating. They just knew Canada would be the 14th state. Okay? Here's an interesting provision of the Articles. The past debts were to be honored. Well, what past debts? Basically, all the past debts that have been incurred by the different states in fighting the war. Why was this such a unique thing? Because over in Europe, guess what a new government would do? A bank, and most time governments would borrow from banks. The banker would go into the ruler and say, could we get a payment on our loan to you? And the king would say, what loan? Well, the money we loaned you to fight this war you just fought a few months ago. Oh, the king said, that's the old government that had that debt. We've reorganized the government. We don't have any debt to you. You see what happened? This is a favorite trick of tyrants in the past. They wanted to get out of debt. What do?
Change the government.
Change the government, reorganize the government. And the founders said, we'll have none of that.
No dishonesty.
We incurred the debt, doesn't matter what government we had, we incurred the debt, we will honor the debt. And when they put that into the Articles of Confederation, boy, that just lifted the credit and the honor of the United States. And people started thinking, whoa, these people they're honorable. You'll see what happens with that. Okay? Then we come to the very last article, Article 13, which is probably the most disastrous of all. What was it? You can amend the Articles of Confederation, but any amendment required what?
Unanimous vote.
Unanimous vote. How many times do you think it was amended?
It wasn't amended, was it?
Yeah, not at all. Because how often can you get unanimity in politics? Very, very seldom.
It is
The
possible.
problem with the unanimous vote, as we saw in Principle 20, what is the problem with that?
Gives the minority power.
Gives the minority power over the majority. The minority of one state can stop the whole thing. And that's why, basically, when the founders got together in the convention, they had to do what with the Articles of Confederation?
Throw them out without voting.
Set them aside. Start over again. Everybody see that? Okay. So what are the weaknesses? Let's enumerate 4 weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation.
Needs unanimous vote.
No executive. Makes it real great when you're trying to fight a war and you're sitting around in Congress debating on whether to move troops here or there. I mean, you can't just sit around debating when it's in a war. You got to have action. And that's why in our Constitution today we have what we call war powers of the President. We actually give the President certain, what might be termed ruler powers. He's the commander-in-chief, and if we're at war with a declaration of war, the commander-in-chief, he can say, we need this highway, we need this factory to produce this and this. Almost like a ruler, right? Like a dictator. But what's supposed to happen after the war's over? All that goes back. And after World War I and World War II, guess what didn't happen?
Didn't all go back.
All of those regulations and all of those agencies of government that were created during the war, they didn't go back. They didn't dissolve. And that's one of the real things that's happened after wars. And that's one of the reasons why some people say we need to have another war. And we'll show you who said that. Ronnie?
Was the IRS created during wartime?
Well, the income tax was, of course, brought about in 1913, and then the mode of collecting that was the Internal Revenue Service. So, yeah. Okay? No executive. What else have we pointed out? Actually, we didn't point this one out. There was no federal judiciary. What would happen under the Articles of Confederation, and this did happen, when, for example, a foreign minister, in other words, an official from another country, had a problem, say he committed a crime, where would the crime be adjudicated? Where would he be tried? If there's no federal judiciary, he would be tried in a state court. What, an official of France or an official of England being tried in a state court of the United States? See, this is down one level from the national level. This was very demeaning. And there was an issue made of it, but Articles of Confederation did not provide for a judiciary. What else didn't it provide for? The power to tax. You got to have the power to tax, especially to keep the government going in a time of war and to provide for the means to fight the war. You cannot rely just on the charitable contribution of the citizens to fight a war. We found that out. Okay? Washington found that out. And, as we said, there's no power to enforce the decrees. These were just nice suggestions. Won't you please send supplies to General Washington? And that didn't work. Well, I want you to look at the chart on page 69 down at the bottom. You have to say that the Articles of Confederation was where on our political spectrum between anarchy and tyranny. It's too close to anarchy. Would you agree with that? In other words, it wasn't strong enough. But they intentionally didn't want it to be strong enough because they had just broken from where? A strong, centralized government under King George. Can you understand why the founders, in trying to find that, what do we call that magic point? The balanced center, they went from a strong tyranny and missed it because they were so afraid of it. We don't want anybody ruling over us. They were too close to anarchy. Do you think perhaps they needed that experience? Yeah. So that by the time they had to rewrite it, they said, well, we got to strengthen the federal government. And then that's when they found the balanced center. So this was a great experience. But you just tried to convince General Washington that this was a great experience when he's out there freezing to death with his men and seeing them die. Our government now definitely has taken upon themselves more power. See, we have not kept our government in the balanced center.
So what if we stayed with the Articles of Confederation? And what do we do now?
If we would have stayed with the Articles,
Yes.
well, there's no question, the whole Union would have dissolved. We wouldn't have had a Union. We'll see that when we study what happened right up before the convention. It was about ready to break up right then. Okay? Let's talk for a minute about General Washington. When they knew that they were going to have to take on the British, General Washington, George Washington, was a delegate to Congress from Virginia. And he had had prior military experience. And one of the fellows, one of the delegates in Congress, stood up, and his purpose was to nominate a person that would be the commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Army, commander-in-chief of the Army of the United States of America. And as he started to make his speech, General Washington, well, not general at this time, George Washington is sitting over here as a delegate from Virginia. And the fellow said something like, "There is a man among us who has had remarkable experience in military activity. He is from the state of Virginia." What would Washington be thinking right now? Uh-oh. George Washington was the kind of a guy who didn't like to have accolades thrust upon him. So what does he do? Gets up and walks out. And by the time he comes back, guess what? He's the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And what a great one he was. So his first assignment was where? No, it was up in Boston. "General, we're assembling an army up in Boston. We want you to go up there and take Boston." So George Washington gets up to Boston, and what does he find? You got these thousands of men who had been out, you know, plowing their fields or working in the stores all throughout the colonies. And the charge came, put down your plow, put down your goods, pick up your weapon, and get to Boston. There's a fight brewing. And so they all come to Boston. Did they have nice uniforms? Did they have nice military discipline training? No, none of that. And where was Boston? Let's describe Boston. Do you know this? In those days, how many of us have been to Boston? Some of us are going this year, right? What?
Can't take Boston without me.
Because Boston at that point, if you go to Boston today, you can drive right into the heart of Boston. If you went to Boston in the days of the founders, what would you have to do to go to Boston? Most of the time, take a boat, because it's a little island connected by just a narrow neck of land to the mainland. You got all the British in Boston. This is General Howe, and the British Army has basically taken Boston. Washington said, or his orders were, to go up and take Boston. And you got all these men just looking for a fight out there, day after day after day, and they can't fight the British, so guess who they start fighting? Themselves. This is an unruly mob. And Washington gets up there, and he must have thought to himself after seeing them, "This is the army with which I am supposed to win the war against the most powerful nation on the earth?" Would have been pretty discouraging. Anyway, he was the commander-in-chief, and his army consisted of an unorganized band of farmers, merchants, and sailors, everybody looking for a fight. There was no training, no one was in charge, there were no uniforms, there were no provisions, there were no supplies, and we're taking on the largest army and the largest navy in the world. What would you have thought? Impossible task. But, and if it had been a man of lesser mettle than George Washington, any one of these times, many of these situations happened during the war, it would have been easy to just give up and say, this is impossible. But not with George Washington. I'll tell you about a group of men who kind of came out of the backwoods under the leadership of a guy by the name of Daniel Morgan. These guys had long rifles, hence they were called Daniel Morgan's long riflemen. They could hit a 7-inch target at 250 yards. What do you mean, so? Is that easy to do even today? 250 yards. That's 2.5 football fields. Oh yeah, you got nice sighting and so forth, but these are long rifle muskets. Anyway, these guys, nobody was going to tell them what to do. And nobody could control them until George Washington came onto the scene. And Washington commanded such a presence or his presence commanded such awe that Daniel Morgan and his men obeyed George Washington. But he's the only one they would obey. And Morgan actually said it. We're taking our orders only from the general. Well, I mean, you appreciate loyalty like that, but hey, folks, we're all one group here. We're not just little groups like this. Washington found out that Daniel Morgan's long riflemen could give him quite a service. For example, he would assign them to climb up into the trees during battle and pick off whom?
The British.
Well, which British? The officers. The officers. And with this kind of accuracy, it's what they did. Proved to be pretty effective fighters. Daniel Morgan. Well, did you enjoy the reading of the expedition into Canada? Because Continental Congress knew we've got to get Canada. We've got to clean out the British from Canada, because that was a place where many British troops had staged. And so who had the assignment up in Canada? As we said, Canada, they wanted it to become the 14th state. They treated it like a state. And it was Benedict Arnold and General Montgomery who had the assignments to go up into Canada and to capture Montreal and to secure the Canadian territory for the United States. He was Benedict Arnold's trek. Did you read about his trek? This is on page 73. It was planned to be for 20 days. How long did it take? 45 days. Well, what happens when your trek is twice as long? Now, this is on foot, right? Twice as long. You run out of food. What happens when you run out of food?
People start to get upset.
Did you read this? En route, their food had given out. I'm on page 73, first column at the bottom. To survive, they had eaten broth made from boiling their moccasins and leather breeches. Hello? Boiling their clothing. They even killed and ate their dogs.
I'd eat my dog.
I mean, that's what you do if you're hungry, right? Their shoes wore out. I mean, folks, look at this picture on the top of page 73. We're talking 180-mile march through icy water. Can you imagine marching 180 miles? That's from here to where? 180 miles? Oh, it's 3 times to Payson. 180 miles? Page? Marching? Long way. Well, bitter cold. This is the winter time. Bitter cold, smallpox broke out, and what a disaster. General Montgomery was killed in the battle for Montreal. Benedict Arnold and his men, many of them froze. So they had to retreat altogether. Benedict Arnold was wounded, and they eventually had to realize, we've got to get out of Canada. Did we ever go back? No. Remember, this is one of the disastrous events of 1776. We lost Canada. Never to go back. And Canada never did become the 14th state. Okay. The last little story we'll start with here is the first great victory. Washington had to have a victory. And his specific assignment from Congress was to take Boston. You got to drive the British out of Boston. That's not easy to do. But Washington had a plan. First of all, we have to mention all the men had gathered around Boston, but there wasn't anybody to fight. So they not only fought each other, 4,000 of his men left. Said, we're going home. We'll be back if you need us. Just call us. Just let us know. And but 4,000. His men just leave. Their enlistments were very short. This is the great way to start out a war, isn't it? Have 4,000 of your men leave. How are you going to take Boston? You got the British, you got surrounded by the bay, which now is all filled in, but then it was a bay, and you're out here. The only way you can do it, somebody suggested, is to get cannon and set them up and lob them into Boston if you have to drive the British out. Well, where are we going to get the cannon? Somebody said, you know what, Ethan Allen, did you hear Ethan Allen this morning? What he just did, he and his Green Mountain boys, they burned Fort Ticonderoga. Where was that? Let's see, do you see your map on page 72? Right about in the middle, on the Hudson River. Do you see Fort Ticonderoga just above Lake George? That's quite a ways from Boston. You see where Boston is, and you see Fort Ticonderoga. General Washington has an interesting fellow who's very loyal, remains very loyal to the general throughout the whole war. His name? Henry Knox. Well, who's Henry Knox? Well, first of all, he was a big man, weighed about 300 pounds, mostly muscle, we presume. And what experience had he had in military warfare? Not much, but Washington needed a person in charge of the artillery. And Henry Knox had read lots of books on artillery because he was a librarian.
That's funny.
And he said, Henry, do you think you can go get those cannon that are buried in the ashes at Fort Ticonderoga and get them down here? And Henry Knox said, yes, sir, General. I'll get them. So Henry Knox takes a bunch of men, gets up to Fort Ticonderoga, gets the cannon out of the ashes, says, well, we got this river right here, the Hudson River, that hadn't frozen over completely. We'll just build a few barges, put the cannon on them, and float them down the river and then over across to Boston. Builds a few barges, puts a couple of cannon on them, found out cannon were too heavy, right down at the bottom of the river. So they had to fish the cannon out of the river. How are we going to get these cannon to Boston? Ox. We're going to build sleds. And that's what they did. They built sleds. I mean, there's snow out, and so they built sleds, put these cannon on the sleds, and went over the river and through the woods to... And the record says, did you read it in here? What happened? By the way, where'd they get the oxen?
From the
On the
farmers.
farms.
Yeah. They expropriated. What does that mean?
Took them.
Just kind of
They
said,
leave
folks,
them
the general needs the oxen. Went to the farmers around and said, we need your oxen. Got to have them. See, that's what you have to do during wartime. Got to have them. So took the oxen, and the story goes, what happens when an ox would stumble or become lame or otherwise debilitated, couldn't pull? Henry Knox would put on the harness and pull. And Henry Knox, he gets the oxen down, or gets the cannon down to Washington. Incredible. I'm sure Washington was stunned that this even took place in the dead of winter. So you got the oxen, or the cannon here, 59 of them, 59 cannon. And Washington puts his men to work mounting, digging these cannon in. Now when you dig in a cannon, you got to dig into the ground. This is frozen ground you're digging in. Almost all of those cannon were in place in one night. So the British intelligence didn't even know they were there. Until General Howe walks out of his quarters, the story goes, the next morning to get a breath of fresh air, you know. And he hears these cannon firing. And he looks up on Dorchester Heights, which is the heights above Boston across the bay to the south. He looks up there and he sees those cannon. Looks back at his barracks, his buildings, and he says, and he knows that they're in range. Looks back up at the cannon, looks out to the ships, knows they're in range. And the story goes, he said one word, checkmate. And says, men, let's evacuate. And the British, over the next couple of weeks, put as much of their belongings and furniture and things on board ship and sailed out of the Boston harbor.
Didn't they get washed back on shore?
No, not in that story.
No, that was New York.
And Washington then told his men, let's go take Boston. And as they came into Boston, the British having left, this was on March the 17th, which is what? St. Patrick's Day. He said, that was a Saturday. He says, tomorrow is Sunday. You go to the church of your choice and you thank God that we took Boston without a drop of blood being shed. That was an incredible victory that Washington had to have. I mean, everything up to this point was pretty discouraging, and everything, the next thing is going to be awfully discouraging. Washington had to have a victory once in a while for the morale of the troops. And just in the nick of time, he would have it. Next time we get together, we will visit with the material beginning on page 76 as we tell you what happened in Washington's attempt to take New York. It's a good thing he had the Boston victory experience. Thank you very much.